If my size offends you, Mountainman, don't taste my food. Sometimes the Lord works through the humblest vessels to teach us the hardest lessons about judging folks by their appearance. In the autumn of 1880, high in the Colorado Territory, where men lived by the strength of their backs and the steadiness of their character, one woman would show an entire logging camp that true worth runs deeper than what meets the eye. The pre-dawn darkness of Mercy Hawthorne's boarding house room held the familiar chill of another hopeful beginning. Her work-worn hands moved with practiced ease around the small iron cook stove, stirring venison stew that had simmered through the night hours. The coal oil lamp cast dancing shadows across her generous frame as she ladled the fragrant mixture into her father's old Dutch oven. Steam rose from cornbread cooling on the windowsill, filling the small room with the honest smell of good cooking. Dried apple compote waited in a ceramic jar, sweetened with the last of her precious molasses. Everything just so. Everything ready. Everything riding on this single chance at decent work before winter's harsh bite reached the Colorado high country. Mercy wrapped her blue calico dress tight against the September morning chill and hefted the heavy pot. The boarding house stairs creaked their familiar protest, but Mrs. O'Sullivan's voice followed her down anyway. Those mountain fellows got no use for gentle ways. Girl, they'll chew you up and spit you out before the coffee gets cold. The Irish woman's warning echoed in Mercy's mind as she stepped into the gray morning air. 30 minutes of steep climbing lay ahead, rocky trail winding up toward Copper Ridge where Jake Morrison's logging crew worked the timber claims. 30 minutes to carry hope in an iron pot and pray the good Lord might favor competence over appearance. Her sturdy boots found familiar purchase on the mountain path. The Dutch oven's weight pulled at her arms, but she'd carried heavier burdens. After Papa's passing last spring, bills had piled up faster than her seamstress wages could cover them. Winter meant no outdoor work, no extra income, no way forward except this single opportunity that had appeared on Sullivan's store bulletin board. Cook wanted, mountain camp, must be strong worker. Simple words that had set her heart racing with the first real hope she'd felt in months. The trail switchbacked through stands of pine and golden aspen, their leaves already touched with autumn's hand. Mercy paused twice to rest and shift her grip, perspiration dampening her dress despite the crisp air. Below, the town of Cedar Falls spread across the valley floor like scattered wooden blocks. Above, wood smoke from the logging camp drifted between the trees, carrying the promise of hungry men and honest wages. Almost there now. The sound of axes and crosscut saws grew clearer with each step. Men's voices carried on the thin mountain air, rough and easy with each other's company. Mercy's stomach tightened with the familiar knot of uncertainty. She'd faced rejection before seamstress work went to prettier girls, when customers had their choice. But this felt different somehow. Final. Like the last card in a losing hand. The camp opened before her in a cleared meadow canvas wall tents arranged around a central fire pit. Fresh-cut lumber stacked in neat piles, and a dozen men who stopped their morning preparations to stare. Wood smoke from their cooking fire mingled with the scent of bacon grease and unwashed wool. The honest smells of working men. Jake Morrison stood near the largest tent, a man built solid as the mountains themselves' broad shoulders, weather-beaten face, and eyes that took quick measure of everything they surveyed. His gaze traveled from her flour sack bundle to her flushed face to the generous curves that no amount of careful dressing could disguise. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to polite dismissal in the space of a heartbeat. "Don't reckon what you brought matters much, Miss." His voice carried the flat finality of a man used to making quick decisions and sticking by them. This here's rough work, not suited for. He gestured vaguely at her substantial form, leaving the sentence hanging like morning mist. Mercy set the Dutch oven on the rough pine table with deliberate care. Steam escaped around the iron lid, carrying rich aromas of slow-cooked meat and herbs that made the watching men shift closer despite themselves. She met Jake's eyes directly, her voice steady as mountain stone. "If my size troubles you that much, mister, then don't bother tasting what's inside." The words fell into silence, broken only by the distant tap-tap-tap of a woodpecker and the soft hiss of escaping steam. Mercy turned without waiting for response and walked back toward the trail, her spine straight and her head held high. Behind her, 12 men watched her disappear into the timber, while the aroma of her cooking lingered like an unanswered question hanging in the mountain air. When the first bite awakened memory, sometimes a single moment can shatter everything we thought we knew about ourselves and leave us standing in the ruins of our own poor judgment. In that Colorado mountain camp, as evening shadows stretched long across the meadow and the last echoes of honest labor faded into twilight, Jake Morrison stood before a simple iron pot that would force him to confront the ugliest corners of his own heart. What happened next would haunt him through the darkness and send him stumbling down a mountain trail in desperate pursuit of a redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. For in that one transformative bite, the taste of truth proved more powerful than a lifetime of shallow assumptions. And Jake would discover that some hungers of the soul can only be satisfied when we finally see past the surface to the human heart beating beneath. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he uses nothing more than a good woman's cooking to reveal the poverty of a man's character. Jake circled that iron pot like a man wrestling with his own shadow. All afternoon, while his crew split logs and stacked timber, the aroma had tormented him something fierce, rich and deep, layered with flavors, nothing like the beans and salt pork that usually sustained mountain camps. The Dutch oven sat exactly where Mercy had placed it. No more steam rising from its sealed lid, but something else lingering, the ghost of what might have been. "Just pitch it out," muttered Pete Kowalski, pausing in his work to mop sweat from his brow. "Woman's long gone. Food'll spoil sitting there like that." But Jake couldn't bring himself to touch it every time he approached. His mother's voice whispered from some buried corner of memory. How she'd hummed hymns while cooking Sunday dinner. How her full figure had moved with such grace around their little kitchen back in Ohio. How she'd poured love into every meal until the consumption took her 3 winters past. He shook his head hard, driving away thoughts that had no proper place in a timber camp. Evening arrived with the suddenness of mountain country. One moment the sun blazed through pine branches, the next it dropped behind granite peaks and washed the world in purple shadow. The crew gathered around their fire pit, hungry and bone-tired, expecting their usual supper of beans and bacon. Jake's stomach growled loud enough to draw notice. "Boss looks like he could eat a grizzly bear," observed Tommy Sullivan, coaxing life back into the evening fire. At 19, Tommy still carried the easy optimism of youth, before the mountains taught their harder lessons about survival and loss. "Could eat most anything right about now," Jake admitted, his gaze drifting back to that covered pot like iron filings to a magnet. Bill Taggart, oldest of the crew at 53, followed Jake's stare and let out a snort of disgust. "Still mooning over that heavy woman's cooking. She's long gone, Morrison, probably halfway back to whatever kitchen she crawled out of." The crude words hit Jake like cold creek water, but he held his tongue. Bill spoke the language most mountain men understood: direct, unforgiving, stripped of sentiment. Yet something twisted unpleasant in Jake's chest at hearing Mercy described that way. As the crew settled into their evening routines of cleaning tools and mending gear, Jake found himself alone with his curiosity and the weight of his own foolish pride. The campfire crackled lower. Stars emerged bright and cold in the clear mountain air. And still that pot sat waiting, patient as a gravestone. His feet carried him forward before conscious thought could stop them. The lid lifted with surprising ease, releasing aromas that stopped his breath clean. Venison so tender, it had surrendered to long, patient cooking. Carrots and potatoes that had absorbed the very essence of meat and herbs. A broth dark with wisdom and care. The kind that could only come from hands that understood the sacred trust between cook and fed. His wooden spoon, carved from pine during long winter evenings years past, trembled slightly as he lifted it to his lips. The first taste hit his tongue like a revelation straight from heaven. Not just food, memory, recognition. His mother's hands shaping dumplings for Sunday dinner. Her gentle voice calling him in from evening chores. The way she'd made their tiny cabin feel like the very center of God's good earth, through nothing more than careful attention and endless, patient love. Jake's throat closed around emotions he'd buried with her body in that little cemetery outside Akron. Martha Morrison had been a substantial woman, soft where the world demanded hardness, gentle where others required toughness. And Lord help him, she had cooked like this with the same attention to every small detail, the same mysterious transformation of humble ingredients into something approaching grace. The wooden spoon clattered to the table as Jake's hands began to shake. How many years had it been since he'd tasted food prepared with such care? How many meals had he wolfed down without thought, treating sustenance like fuel instead of the gift it truly was? When had he become the kind of man who could look at a woman like Mercy and see only her size instead of her skill, her heart, her God-given talents? The venison fell apart on his tongue, each bite revealing new depths of flavor that spoke of recipes passed down through generations, of knowledge earned through practice and love. This wasn't camp cooking. This was artistry disguised as simple fare, the kind of gift his own dear mother had possessed. And he had dismissed it, dismissed her, without so much as a word of consideration or basic Christian courtesy. Jake's stomach lurched, but not from hunger. The taste that should have brought comfort now carried the bitter edge of shame. His mother had died cooking meals like this, pouring herself into every pot and pan while the lung sickness slowly hollowed her from within. And her son, her only son, had grown into the kind of man who would reject such gifts based on nothing more than the vessel that contained them. The realization hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs. He was running before the thought fully formed in his mind. His boots found the rocky trail by starlight, muscle memory guiding him down the switchbacks he'd climbed 100 times before. Branches caught at his shirt. Loose stones skittered away beneath his feet, like his own scattered thoughts. Behind him, the crew's confused voices faded into the mountain silence. What in tarnation had gotten into their boss? Where was he going in such desperate haste? Jake didn't rightly know himself. Only that something precious had walked away from his camp today, and his pride had been too blind to recognize its true worth. The trail stretched endlessly downward through pools of shadow and pale moonlight. Each step carried him further from the safety of known routines and deeper into the unfamiliar territory of genuine regret. How did a man find someone he'd wronged when he didn't even know her proper name? How did he apologize for a cruelty so casual it had seemed like simple common sense at the time? Cedar Falls lay dark and mostly sleeping when Jake finally stumbled into its dirt streets, his chest heaving from the desperate run. A few windows still glowed with lamplight. The saloon. The boarding houses. Places where late-night business continued despite the hour. He tried the Sullivan place first, then O'Malley's, then the widow Patterson's establishment near the white-steepled church. Heavy-set woman, blue calico dress, came through today carrying a pot. Headshakes and suspicious stares met his inquiries. Mountain men didn't often come calling at respectable boarding houses after midnight, wild-eyed and breathing hard from desperate running. At Mrs. O'Sullivan's place, the Irish proprietor cracked her door just wide enough to peer through the security chain. "Mercy Hawthorne checked out this afternoon," she said curtly, her voice carrying the disapproval of someone who'd seen too many men make poor choices. Paid her bill and took the evening stage toward Denver, said something about visiting her sister back east. The door closed with a finality that echoed through Jake's chest like a church bell tolling. Gone. The word hammered against his skull as he stood alone in the empty street, surrounded by the honest smells of wood smoke and horse manure. Whatever chance he'd had to make things right had departed with the westbound stage, carrying away the woman whose cooking had shattered his comfortable assumptions about worth and value and the proper way to judge his fellow human beings. Jake walked slowly back toward the mountain trail, his earlier urgency replaced by the heavier weight of opportunity lost forever. Above him, the peaks stood silent and unforgiving, keeping their own counsel about the mistakes men make and the prices they pay for seeing only surfaces instead of souls. The taste of her venison stew lingered on his tongue like an accusation he couldn't answer, a reminder of the grace he'd rejected and might never taste again. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. The unexpected return. Dawn crept across the mountain peaks like spilled milk, pale and cold. Jake's boots crunched through frost-brittle grass as he climbed the familiar switchbacks, his breath forming white puffs in the thin air. Sleep had fled from him completely every time he'd closed his eyes. The taste of that venison stew had returned, carrying with it the weight of his mother's disappointed spirit. The camp stirred to life around dying embers. Tommy poked the fire back to reluctant flame while Bill cursed the mountain cold with words that would make a preacher blush. Pete emerged from his tent scratching his belly and looking around for coffee that wouldn't come until someone got serious about breakfast. Jake paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the familiar scene of canvas and rough timber, everything exactly as he'd left it. Everything except a figure sat motionless on the pine stump near the cook fire, generous frame wrapped in the same blue calico dress. Dark hair pinned back with the same careful attention. Another iron pot resting at her feet. Steam rising from its lid into the cold mountain air like incense from an altar. Mercy Hawthorne. Solid as the mountains themselves, waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned not to expect welcome but had come anyway. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to break free. The crew hadn't noticed her yet, still fumbling through their morning routines with the sluggish movements of men not yet fully awake. But there she sat, hands folded in her lap like a woman in church, watching him with eyes that held no anger, no accusation, just the steady assessment of someone measuring the character of the man before her. His feet carried him forward without conscious command. Each step across the frost-stiff grass felt like walking through thick molasses. What did a man say to someone he'd wronged so completely? How did apologies work when the injury had been dealt in front of witnesses who'd remember every word 20 feet away? He opened his mouth to speak. She raised one weathered hand, palm out, stopping him as effectively as if she'd built a stone wall between them. Save your breath for working, mister. Her voice carried the flat authority of someone used to cutting through nonsense before it could take root. I didn't come back for pretty words or explanations. Fresh rabbit stew scented the air around her, different from yesterday's venison, but carrying the same promise of skill and careful attention. Jake's stomach clenched with hunger that went deeper than mere food. Then why, I need wages. The words dropped like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Winter's coming fast as a runaway horse, and pretty don't pay bills. You need someone who can cook for 12 men without poisoning half of them or burning down the camp. Simple arithmetic. Her dark eyes never wavered from his face. No pleading, no explanation of hurt feelings or damaged pride. Just the practical assessment of two people who might find mutual benefit in an arrangement neither particularly wanted. Respect gets respect, she continued, her tone suggesting this was the only negotiation he'd get. Nothing more, nothing less. Work hard, eat well, keep your opinions about my appearance to yourself and we'll get along fine. Behind him, Tommy's voice rose in surprise. Well, I'll be switched, boss. Looks like we got ourselves a cook after all. The rest of the crew began to take notice, emerging from tents and gathering around coffee cups with the cautious interest of men who'd witnessed yesterday's rejection and weren't sure what to make of this unexpected second chance. Mercy's gaze remained fixed on Jake's face, patient as stone carved by centuries of weather, waiting for his answer with the stillness of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment but hoped anyway. But something in the way her fingers gripped each other just a little too tightly suggested this calm confidence might be costing her more than she was willing to admit. And from the corner of his eye, Jake caught sight of Charlie Walsh emerging from his tent with a calculating expression that promised trouble ahead. Setting boundaries, Jake's throat worked around words that wouldn't form proper sentences. The morning air bit at his exposed skin while steam from Mercy's pot rose between them like a challenge thrown down. Behind him, boots shuffled against frozen ground as his crew gathered closer, coffee cups warming their hands while they waited to see which way their boss would jump. Ma'am, the words scraped out rough as pine bark. Reckon we could use someone who knows their way around a cook fire. Not an apology, not the groveling she probably expected after last night's desperate run down the mountain. Just acknowledgement wrapped in mountain practicality, the kind of bargain two sensible people might strike. Mercy's chin lifted half an inch. $50 a month, plus board. 30, 45. Take it or I walk back down that trail right now and you can explain to your crew why they're eating beans and hardtack through winter? Jake's jaw tightened. Most camp cooks earned 25 if they were lucky. But the aroma drifting from her pot made his stomach clench with want, and winter would trap them up here for months with whoever signed on now. 40. Final offer? She considered this with the deliberate care of someone calculating rent money and grocery bills. Her fingers drummed once against her knee, the only sign that this negotiation mattered more than her steady voice suggested. 40 it is. She stood, brushing dust from her calico skirt with brisk movements. But I'll need the lean-to shelter fixed proper. Canvas walls won't hold against mountain winter, and I won't freeze to death for anyone's convenience. Pete can see to that today. And I cook what I cook. How I cook it. No complaints about seasoning or portions, or why supper ain't ready when you think it ought to be. Fair enough. One more thing. Her dark eyes fixed on his with the intensity of someone drawing a line in bedrock. Any man in this camp wants to comment on my size, my appearance, or what I ought to be doing instead of cooking, he can take it up with you. I won't tolerate disrespect from your crew any more than I'll tolerate it from you. The words hung in the cold air like a gauntlet thrown down. Behind Jake, someone, probably Bill Taggart, made a sound that might have been a snort or a cough. Mercy's gaze flicked past Jake's shoulder, and her expression hardened another degree. "Something amusing back there, Mr. Bill stepped forward, a man built like a badger and twice as ornery. 53 years of hard living had carved deep lines around his eyes and taught him that the world respected strength above all else, especially when it came wrapped in a woman's skirts. "Just wondering what makes you think you can handle real mountain work, lady? Cooking for lumber crews ain't like serving tea to church ladies at Sunday social." Mercy set her pot down with deliberate care and walked past Jake toward the woodpile. Her boots crunched through frost toward the stack of split pine that needed moving to the cook shelter. She bent, wrapped her arms around an armload that would challenge most men, and straightened without visible strain. The log settled against her chest with a solid thunk. She turned back toward Bill, breathing steady despite the weight pressing against her ribs. "Anything else you'd like to know about my abilities?" Bill's mouth opened, then closed. Around the fire, the rest of the crew studied their coffee with sudden fascination, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes directly. Mercy carried the wood to the lean-to in 3 trips, each load substantial enough to make her point without wasting breath on argument. No huffing, no dramatic displays of effort. Just the quiet competence of someone used to pulling her own weight and then some. When she returned, her cheeks held the flush of exertion, but her breathing remained even. "Pete Kowalski, is it?" She addressed the youngest crew member directly, a sandy-haired boy of 22 who'd been watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "I'll need that shelter chinked proper against wind, and a real chimney for the cook stove. Not just a stovepipe stuck through canvas like some kind of afterthought." Pete nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I can get started right after breakfast. Tommy Sullivan, you'll be hauling water from the spring twice daily, morning and evening, full buckets. I won't cook with water that's been sitting around growing things nobody wants to eat." Tommy straightened like a soldier receiving orders. "Yes, ma'am." She moved through the crew like a general assigning duties, and Jake found himself stepping back to watch. This wasn't the timid woman who'd climbed their trail yesterday carrying hope in an iron pot. This was someone who'd spent the night making calculations and arrived with a plan already formed in her mind. "Bill Taggart." Her voice carried no warmth when she reached the grizzled miner. "I'll need kindling split fine for the morning cook fire. Pencil-thin pieces, not chunks big enough to choke a horse. Think you can manage that?" Bill's face darkened like a thundercloud, building over the peaks. "Lady, I've been splitting wood since before you were..." "Fine kindling," Mercy repeated, her tone suggesting the conversation was finished whether he liked it or not. "Every evening before supper, no exceptions." She turned back to Jake, leaving Bill glowering at her back, like a man who'd been slapped in front of his friends. "I start work now. Breakfast in 1 hour." She paused, her gaze traveling across the assembled crew with the same measuring look she'd given the woodpile. "And gentlemen, I'm here to cook your food and keep you fed through winter. Not to be your entertainment or the subject of your speculation. We'll get along fine if you remember that distinction." The rabbit stew proved even better than yesterday's venison, thick with vegetables that had absorbed hours of slow simmering. Biscuits light enough to float on morning air. Gravy that made grown men close their eyes and make sounds they probably didn't realize they were making. Jake watched his crew eat with the concentrated attention of miners who'd struck a rich vein. Even Bill Taggart cleaned his plate twice, though he managed to do it without making eye contact with Mercy or offering anything resembling thanks. As the men prepared for the day's work, Jake lingered near the cook fire where Mercy scrubbed tin plates in a basin of heated water. The familiar routine of cleaning up after feeding others, the kind of work that never ended and rarely earned proper appreciation. Yesterday. Yesterday's finished. She didn't look up from her washing. Today's what matters now. Still, I should've. Should've what? Now she did look at him, her hands still in the soapy water. Welcomed a stranger with open arms. Trusted someone you never met. This ain't a church social, Jake Morrison. This is business, plain and simple. The use of his first name caught him off guard. He'd given orders and made introductions, but hearing it from her lips felt strangely intimate, like she'd claimed some small piece of territory he hadn't realized he was surrendering. How'd you know my name? A small smile touched the corner of her mouth, the first genuine warmth he'd seen from her since her return. Mrs. O'Sullivan mentioned it when I asked about the job posting. Said you were hard but fair with your crew. High praise from that old battle axe. Jake found himself almost smiling back. Almost. Then he caught sight of Bill Taggart watching them from across the camp, his expression unreadable but intense, in a way that set warning bells ringing in Jake's mind. Something wrong, Bill? The older man shook his head and turned back to checking his equipment, but Jake noticed how his hands lingered on the handle of his splitting maul, and how his gaze kept drifting back toward Mercy with a tension that felt different from simple curiosity. More calculating. More personal. Like a man working through a problem that had no easy solution and might require the kind of direct action that left permanent marks. The first real test, the fourth morning, brought the real trial by fire. Jake watched from the timber cutting as Mercy emerged from her lean-to before first light, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd learned to work by feel alone. The cook fire bloomed to life under her hands, flames licking at kindling that Bill had split grudgingly into the precise thickness she'd demanded. Steam rose from the coffee pot like morning prayers. The scent of bacon grease heating in her iron skillet drifted across the camp, drawing 12 hungry men toward consciousness with the promise of something better than mere survival. But Charlie Walsh had different plans brewing in his head. Charlie worked the crosscut saw with Pete, a lean man in his 30s who drifted up from Texas cattle country with stories that changed depending on how much whiskey had loosened his tongue. He'd been quiet during Mercy's first days, watching her with the cautious interest of someone evaluating new livestock for purchase. This morning, he decided to test exactly how much pressure she could bear before breaking. "Coffee tastes weak," he announced, setting his tin cup down harder than necessary on the rough pine table. "Back home in Texas, we made coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe nail." Mercy glanced up from the bacon she was turning, her movements never pausing. "Coffee's the same strength as yesterday. Same beans. Same creek water. Well, it ain't strong enough for real work." Charlie leaned back in his camp chair, making sure his voice carried to the other men gathering for breakfast with empty bellies and hopeful faces. "Maybe you ain't used to cooking for folks who do more than sit around quilting circles talking about their neighbors." Jake's hands tightened on his coffee cup, hard enough to make his knuckles crack. The crew had fallen silent, forks suspended halfway to mouths, waiting to see how their new cook would handle her first direct challenge from someone looking for a fight. Mercy's face revealed nothing more than granite carved by weather. She served the bacon onto tin plates with the same careful attention she'd shown every meal. Added eggs scrambled with wild onions that Tommy had found growing near the spring, biscuits that steamed when broken open, releasing the honest smell of good wheat flour and careful baking. "Fresh pots on the fire," she said evenly. "Help yourself to stronger, if that suits your taste better." Charlie's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held all the warmth of a rattlesnake's warning. "Appreciate the kindness, but seems like a cook ought to know how to make coffee proper the first time, especially one getting paid extra wages for special skills." The last words carried enough poison to make several men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Tommy Sullivan looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite work up the nerve to cross Charlie in front of everyone. Bill Taggart watched with the focused interest of a man enjoying a cockfight from the safe side of the fence. Jake started to rise, but Mercy's voice cut across the tension like a blade through leather. Charlie Walsh. She set down her spatula and walked toward the water barrels lined up near the cook shelter, each one holding 40 gallons when full. You want stronger coffee? You'll need to help with the water hauling. Can't make coffee any stronger than the water allows. And spring water tastes best when it's fresh drawn. She hefted one of the empty barrels 40 pounds of seasoned oak and settled it against her hip, like it weighed no more than a sack of flour. These need filling twice daily from the spring, quarter-mile down the trail. Steep path both ways with rocks that'll turn an ankle if you're not watching your step. Figure a man of your capabilities. Shouldn't have much trouble with the work. Charlie's face flushed red above his scraggly beard like he'd been slapped in front of his own mother. I ain't hauling water like some camp servant. Then you drink what I make with yesterday's water and keep your complaints to yourself. She hoisted the barrel properly, wood creaking under the strain, and started toward the trail that wound down through pine and aspen to the spring. Her boots found purchase on loose stone and pine needles, each step deliberate despite the unwieldy burden threatening to throw her off balance. The crew watched in dead silence as she disappeared into the timber, leaving only the sound of her footsteps fading and the crackle of bacon grease in the iron pan. Charlie slammed his cup down hard enough to make coffee slosh onto the pine table. Uppity woman thinks she runs this whole dad-blasted camp. Seems to me she's doing the work you said she couldn't handle, Tommy offered quietly, his young voice carrying more courage than his years might suggest. Boy, you best learn when to keep your mouth shut and when to speak up. This ain't your fight. Jake's voice cut through the brewing argument like an axe through green wood. Charlie, finish your breakfast and get to work. We got timber to cut and daylight's burning. But Charlie wasn't finished testing boundaries. When Mercy returned 20 minutes later, sweat darkening her blue dress despite the cool mountain air, he was waiting with a fresh complaint already formed. Biscuits are burned on the bottom. Mercy set the full water barrel down with a thud that shook the ground and sent ripples through the men's coffee cups. She walked to the fire, lifted the Dutch oven lid, and examined the remaining biscuits with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. Bottoms are brown, not burned. Mountain cooking requires adjustments for thin air and dry conditions. These are done exactly right. Well, they ain't done right for me. Charlie pushed his plate away like a spoiled child refusing his vegetables. Maybe you ought to practice more before taking good money for cooking that ain't up to proper standards. The camp had gone dead quiet. Even the distant sound of sawing stopped as men paused their work to listen for whatever explosion might come next. Jake felt his muscles coiling like spring steel wound too tight. Enough was enough. But Mercy moved first. She walked to the woodpile, selected a pine log the thickness of a man's thigh, and set it on the chopping block with deliberate care. Her axe, a single-bit head, on a hickory handle worn smooth by years of use, rose and fell in one fluid motion. The log split clean through with a crack like rifle fire echoing off the mountain walls. She set another log in place, split it clean. Then another, each stroke precise, economical. Splitting wood that would have challenged most of the crew without breaking her rhythm or losing her breath. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the morning chill. Her breathing deepened, but remained steady as church bells. Wood chips scattered around the chopping block as she reduced the pile to stove-length pieces that would burn clean and hot. When she finally stopped, a full cord of split wood lay stacked beside the cook fire, enough to last them through a week of meals. Anything else need doing around camp? Charlie? Or can I get back to cooking breakfast for folks who appreciate honest work? Charlie's mouth worked soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. His gaze traveled from the split wood to Mercy's steady hands to the axe she held with easy familiarity. And whatever challenge he'd planned died unspoken in his throat. "Coffee's fine," he muttered, and stalked away toward the timber cutting like a whipped dog slinking from the porch. The crew returned to eating with careful attention to their plates, but Jake noticed the difference settling over them like morning mist. Tommy Sullivan caught Mercy's eye and nodded respectfully. Pete Kowalski offered to help stack the split wood without being asked. Even old Murphy, who rarely spoke to anyone about anything, grunted approval as he passed the woodpile. Only Bill Taggart remained unmoved, working his way through breakfast with the methodical intensity of a man thinking through larger problems that had no easy solutions. Jake lingered as the crew dispersed to their workstations. Mercy scrubbed the breakfast dishes in water heated over the cook fire. Her movements efficient, despite what must have been aching arms from the wood splitting. "You didn't have to prove anything to Charlie," he said. "Wasn't proving anything." She lifted a plate to examine it in the morning light, checking for spots like a woman who took pride in details. "Just showing what I can do when it needs doing." That was more wood than most men split in a full day. "My father cut timber before he took sick. Taught me to swing an axe proper before I was old enough to reach his shoulder." She set the clean plate in the drying rack with careful precision. "Said a woman living alone better know how to take care of herself, because the world won't do it for her." Jake found himself watching the sure movements of her hands, the economical way she worked through tasks without wasted motion or unnecessary fuss. Yesterday's prejudice felt like something that belonged to a different man entirely. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was that." Mercy paused in her scrubbing, her gaze distant with memory. "Said the measure of a person wasn't what they looked like or where they came from, but what they did when times got hard and nobody was watching to judge them." A shout from the timber cutting interrupted them. Charlie's voice, raised in anger that carried clear across the camp. "Where's my saw blade? Someone's been messing with my equipment." Jake's stomach tightened like a fist. Charlie Walsh was the kind of man who held grudges the way other men held money tight and close and ready to spend when the opportunity presented itself. And when his gaze swept across the camp, it fixed on Mercy with the cold calculation of someone planning payback that would hurt worse than public embarrassment. Deeper Currents evening brought the kind of peaceful quiet that settled over mountain camps like a favorite quilt. The day's work lay stacked in neat piles, timber cut, bark stripped, tools cleaned and stored according to the careful routines that kept men alive in dangerous country. Mercy moved through her own evening rituals with the methodical attention of someone who understood that tomorrow's comfort depended on today's preparation. Jake lingered near the cook fire after the crew had wandered off to their evening diversions. Some played cards in Bill Taggart's tent by lamplight. Others sat on stumps, whittling or mending gear with the patient concentration of men who'd learned to make things last. The normal rhythms of folks who worked hard and slept harder when darkness fell. But Jake found himself drawn to the quiet efficiency of Mercy's dishwashing, the way coal oil lamplight caught the careful attention on her face as she scrubbed tin plates clean in her basin of heated water. "Water's getting cold," he observed, lifting the heavy kettle from its hook over the dying fire. Steam rose as he poured fresh hot water into her basin, the simple act of helpfulness feeling somehow significant in the lamplight. Easier to get things properly clean with good heat. Much obliged. She didn't look up from the plate she was scouring with sand and lye soap. Most men figure kitchen work stops being their concern once their bellies are full and their minds turn to other matters. Most men never learn to do for themselves in any proper way. That drew her attention. Her dark eyes studied his face in the flickering firelight, measuring something she hadn't bothered to look for before. "You sound like you had different schooling than most." Jake settled onto a nearby stump, close enough to help if needed, but far enough to avoid crowding her workspace. The night air carried the scent of pine resin and wood smoke, familiar smells that usually brought comfort after hard days. Tonight they seemed to highlight the unusual intimacy of shared work between folks getting to know each other. My mother made sure of that kind of learning. Said a man who couldn't cook and clean and tend himself wasn't much of a man at all. The words came easier than expected, like water finding its natural course. Lost her 3 winters back to the lung sickness. Been making do with beans and bacon ever since, mostly. Mercy's hands stilled in the soapy water for just a moment. I'm sorry for your loss. That's hard country to walk alone. She would have taken to your cooking something fierce, had the same way of making simple things taste special, like there was love baked right into the bread. What was her given name? Martha. Martha Morrison. Saying it aloud brought the familiar ache, but softer now than it had been. More like remembering an old friend than reopening a fresh wound. She was substantial. Built like you. World never made that easy for her to bear. Mercy resumed her washing, but Jake caught the tightening around her eyes that spoke of old hurts never quite healed. People got strong opinions about women who take up space in this world. Been hearing those opinions since I was old enough to understand the words they were using? Must wear on a person something terrible? Some days more than others? She lifted a clean cup to examine it in the lamplight, checking for spots with the same attention she brought to everything else. Lost my position at the Patterson house last spring. Mrs. Patterson said her husband found my presence distracting during his morning coffee. Apparently, a large woman in the kitchen made him uncomfortable in ways that reflected poorly on the household. The casual cruelty of it hit Jake like a slap across the face. He'd witnessed similar judgments countless times. Had participated in them without much thought. Now the revelation sat heavy in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed. That's why you came up here looking for work. Not many options left in town. Not many options anywhere. Truth be told, she agreed without bitterness. Just the practical acceptance of someone who'd learned to work with the world as it was, rather than as it ought to be. But mountain work pays better than seamstress wages, assuming I can manage to keep the position. You're managing just fine. She glanced at him sideways, something that might have been surprise flickering across her features like candlelight on water. You didn't think so 3 days ago when I climbed that trail. Jake's throat tightened around words that wanted to stick there. The truth sat between them like a confession waiting to be spoken. 3 days ago, I was a fool. Still learning to be less of one, I reckon. They worked in companionable silence after that, Jake drying dishes as Mercy washed them clean. The simple rhythm felt surprisingly peaceful. Hands moving in coordination, each task flowing into the next without need for discussion or direction. When Tommy Sullivan appeared from the direction of the timber cutting, blood seeping through the fingers pressed tight to his left hand, their cooperation shifted into something more urgent than dishwashing. Cut myself on Charlie's saw blade, Tommy said, his young face pale in the lamplight. Blade slipped when I was cleaning pine resin off the teeth. Mercy set down her dish rag immediately. Let me have a look. She guided Tommy to the camp chair near the fire, where light was strongest and steadiest. Her touch, when she examined his injured hand, carried the gentle authority of someone who'd tended plenty of hurts before. Deep cut across the palm, needs proper cleaning and binding. She looked up at Jake. Can you bring that lamp closer and fetch my sewing basket from the lean-to? Cotton strips in the bottom for bandages? Jake positioned the coal oil lamp to throw steady light across Tommy's hand while Mercy worked with quiet efficiency. She cleaned the wound with water heated over the fire, then dabbed it with whiskey from Jake's personal bottle. Tommy hissed through gritted teeth, but held still like a man. Brave boy, Mercy murmured, wrapping clean cotton around his palm with practiced movements that spoke of experience with such injuries. Keep this dry and change the bandage daily. Should heal clean if you don't go looking for trouble. Yes, ma'am. Thank you kindly. Ma'am. As Tommy headed back toward his tent, Jake found himself studying Mercy's profile in the lamplight. The competent way she'd handled the emergency. The gentleness that had accompanied her skill. You've done that before plenty of times. My father had accidents regular. Timber work leaves its marks on a man. She cleaned Tommy's blood from her hands with methodical care. Learned to tend cuts and bruises before I learned to cook proper meals for company. Where'd you learn cooking like what you do? Not from any camp kitchen I ever ate from. A smile ghosted across her mouth, the first genuine warmth he'd seen from her since that morning on the trail when everything started. My grandmother came west in '49 during the gold fever. Fed mining camps from Sacramento to Placerville for near 20 years. Said good food could civilize wild men faster than law or preaching. Smart woman to know that. Smart enough to teach her granddaughter useful skills before she passed. Mercy dried her hands on a clean towel with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Said a woman who could feed people well would never lack for honest work, no matter what else the world thought of her appearance. Jake felt something shift in his chest, like a locked door finding its proper key after years of trying wrong ones. This woman sitting across from him, steady hands tending wounds, turning simple ingredients into meals that made grown men close their eyes with pleasure. She wasn't the burden he'd assumed when she first climbed that trail. She was something considerably rarer. Someone who made the world a better place just by being in it. Your grandmother was right about that. She was about most things that mattered. Mercy began banking the cook fire for the night, covering coals with ash to preserve them until morning brought new needs. Though she never mentioned how lonesome it gets. Being the only woman in a camp full of men who see you as necessary, but not particularly welcome company. The quiet admission hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. Jake found himself leaning forward, drawn by something in her voice that spoke of burdens carried in silence for too long. You're welcome here, Mercy. More than welcome. She looked up from the fire, her dark eyes unreadable in the dim light that remained. Am I, or am I just useful enough to tolerate until something better comes along? The question hit deeper than expected, cutting right to the bone of things he hadn't wanted to examine too closely. Jake's mouth opened to offer easy reassurance, but the words died unspoken when he realized he wasn't entirely certain of the honest answer. From across the camp came the sound of men's voices raised in argument. Charlie Walsh's voice, harsh with drink and something uglier than whiskey. All I'm saying is a woman who looks like that ain't up here just for cooking. Mark my words, she's got other reasons for staying where decent women wouldn't. Bill Taggart's gravelly laugh followed. Other reasons like what? Charlie. Use your head, old man. Woman like that don't get many opportunities with respectable men. Maybe she figures mountain men ain't particular about what they bed down with when winter gets long and lonesome. Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Beside him, Mercy had gone rigid as carved stone, her hands frozen in the act of banking the fire. The cruel words carried clearly across the quiet camp, meant to be heard by anyone still awake, meant to wound and shame and plant seeds of doubt. And from the way Mercy's breathing had gone shallow and careful, they'd found their target sure enough. The storm before peace. The morning supply wagon rolled into camp with Hank Morrison at the reins, dust rising from its iron-shod wheels like a dirty prayer against the clear mountain air. Jake's cousin had made this monthly run for 2 years running, hauling provisions up the treacherous mountain trail with the reliability of sunrise itself. But today, something in Hank's grin set Jake's teeth on edge like fingernails on a slate board. Hank swung down from the wagon seat with the theatrical flourish of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention wherever he went. 42 years old, thick around the middle from too much beer and not enough honest work, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having his assumptions challenged by hard reality. Well, his gaze fixed immediately on Mercy, who was kneading bread dough at the camp table with steady, rhythmic movements. Heard tell you got yourself a cook up here, cousin? Didn't mention she was built for keeping a man warm through the long winter nights. The words dropped into morning quiet like stones into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the watching crew. Around the camp, men paused in their work, Pete securing the wagon's brake with careful attention, Tommy organizing flour sacks into neat stacks, Bill emerging from his tent with the slow deliberation of someone anticipating entertainment at another person's expense. Mercy's hands never stilled in their work, but Jake caught the tightening around her eyes like she'd been slapped. "Supplies look good, Hank." Jake stepped closer to the wagon, positioning himself between his cousin and the camp table where Mercy worked. "Much obliged for making the run up here." "Oh, I always enjoy coming up to see what kind of improvements you've been making to the operation." Hank's laugh carried the ugly edge of shared conspiracy between men who understood each other too well. Though I got to wonder about keeping a woman like that around. Might give the crew ideas about winter entertainment that ain't strictly professional. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides hard enough to make his knuckles crack. "Watch your mouth, Hank." "Easy there, cousin. Just making friendly conversation between family." Hank pulled a tobacco pouch from his vest pocket and began building a cigarette with deliberate slowness, making sure he held everyone's attention. "But you got to admit, woman that size probably don't get much attention from decent men. Might be grateful for whatever company she can find. If you take my meaning." The ugly implications hung in the mountain air like smoke from a green wood fire. From across the camp, Charlie Walsh snickered, the sound of a man who'd found an ally in cruelty and was enjoying the show. "That's enough, Hank, more than enough." But Hank had found his audience and wasn't ready to abandon center stage for anything as simple as common decency. "All I'm saying is you might want to keep both eyes open about things. Woman gets lonesome enough. She might start looking for ways to earn her keep beyond what's strictly cooking and cleaning." The bread dough slammed onto the table with enough force to rattle every tin cup in camp. Mercy's face had gone pale except for 2 spots of color burning high on her cheeks like fever. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Family loyalty warring with fury that built like steam in a boiler. His cousin's words painted pictures that made his stomach turn over and his hands itch for violence. "Hank, get back on that wagon and head down the mountain. Right now." "What's your hurry? Cousin just got here with your monthly supplies." Hank lit his cigarette and took a long, deliberate drag. "Thought maybe I'd stay for supper tonight. Sample some of that famous cooking I've been hearing so much about from folks down in Cedar Falls." "You ain't staying for anything. Come on, Jake. Don't be inhospitable to family blood." Hank's gaze wandered back to Mercy with the calculating attention of a man pricing livestock at market. "Besides, I'm curious what kind of services she provides to earn $40 a month when most cooks get half that." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to wound and humiliate. Jake's vision tunneled down to his cousin's smirking face, blood pounding in his ears, like distant thunder rolling through mountain valleys. "Get out." His voice came out deadly quiet, the kind of tone that made smart men step back and reconsider their choices. "Right now, before I do something we'll both regret." "Hell, cousin. You getting mighty protective of your camp cook all of a sudden." Hank's grin widened with cruel satisfaction. "Makes a man wonder what kind of private arrangements you got worked out between you." Jake moved before conscious thought could stop him. 3 strides brought him close enough to grab Hank's shirt front and haul him up onto his toes like a child caught stealing penny candy. You say one more word about her, one more dad-blasted word, I'll throw you off this mountain myself and let the buzzards sort out what's left. Hank's cigarette tumbled to the dirt, forgotten. His face shifted from amusement to genuine alarm as he met Jake's eyes and saw something there that brooked no argument or negotiation. Easy, Jake. Just having a little fun with you, this is all. Pack your gear and go. Now. Look, maybe I spoke out of turn. Now. Jake released his grip, sending Hank stumbling backward against the wagon wheel hard enough to shake the whole rig. Around the camp, the crew watched with the fascinated attention of men witnessing a family split apart in real time, uncertain which way loyalty ought to run. Hank straightened his shirt with shaking hands, his face dark with wounded pride and family authority challenged. You're making a big mistake, cousin. That woman's got you twisted around thinking she's something special, but she ain't nothing but a desperate old maid looking for whatever scraps of attention she can get. Jake's fist connected with Hank's jaw before the ugly words could finish forming. The blow sent his cousin sprawling in the dirt beside the wagon, blood streaming from his split lip like water from a broken dam. I said get out. Don't make me say it again. Hank struggled to his feet, spitting blood and fury in equal measure. You'll regret this, Jake Morrison. When winter comes and you're trapped up here with that creature, you'll remember that family tried to warn you about what you're really dealing with. He hauled himself onto the wagon seat with wounded dignity, gathered the reins with hands that shook from rage, and whipped his team into motion. The wagon lurched down the mountain trail, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of iron wheels on stone, carrying away whatever remained of family loyalty between the Morrison cousins. Silence settled over the camp like fresh snow, muffling everything except the sound of men breathing and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Jake's knuckles throbbed where they'd connected with bone and tooth. His breathing came hard and fast, adrenaline still singing through his veins like electricity through telegraph wire. Around him, the crew began moving with the careful deliberation of men who'd witnessed something significant and weren't entirely sure how to process what they'd seen. Charlie Walsh broke the quiet first, his voice carrying a note of speculation that made Jake's stomach tighten like a fist. Well, that was mighty interesting to watch. His tone suggested wheels turning behind his eyes, calculations being made. Man fights that hard to defend someone, makes you wonder what he's getting in return for his trouble. Charlie. Jake's voice came out flat and dangerous as a coiled rattlesnake. Shut your mouth. Just saying, boss. Your cousin might have had a point about shut up or get off this mountain. Your choice. Charlie's mouth snapped closed like a trap, but his eyes remained calculating. He exchanged glances with Bill Taggart, some wordless communication passing between them that spoke of alliances forming and plans being laid. Jake turned toward the camp table where Mercy stood with her hands braced against the rough pine surface. Her bread dough lay abandoned, probably ruined by the delay and her obvious distress. Mercy, don't. She didn't look up from the table, her voice carrying a fragility he hadn't heard before. Please don't say anything right now. Just don't. Her words carried the brittle edge of someone holding themselves together through pure willpower alone, as if one wrong word might shatter something essential inside her that could never be properly mended. From across the camp, Jake heard Bill Taggart's gravelly voice, pitched just loud enough to carry to anyone willing to listen. Man defends a woman like that. He's either betting her or planning to. No other reason to choose her over family blood and common sense. 3 men nodded agreement. 3 others looked uncomfortable but said nothing in response. Jake felt the camp dividing around him like water around a stone, loyalties shifting in ways he couldn't control or predict. And at the center of it all stood Mercy, silent and still, bearing the weight of ugly speculation with the same stubborn endurance she brought to every other hardship life had thrown her way. But something in the set of her shoulders suggested even her considerable strength had limits that were being tested. And Charlie Walsh was studying those limits with the patient attention of a man planning his next move in a game where the stakes kept getting higher. Testing faith 3 days after Hank's departure, the poison had spread through camp like gangrene in an untended wound. Men who'd begun treating Mercy with grudging respect now studied her with sideways glances and whispered conversations that died when she approached like flowers touched by early frost. The change showed in small cruelties that cut deeper than open hostility. Coffee cups left unwashed despite her requests, sitting in greasy puddles until she cleaned them herself. Tools borrowed from her work area and returned to wrong places, forcing her to search through camp like a servant hunting lost property. Conversations that shifted to uncomfortable silence when she passed, leaving her isolated in a circle of 12 men who suddenly found the ground fascinating whenever she looked their way. Charlie Walsh led this campaign with the patient persistence of water wearing down stone. Never direct confrontation. Jake had made clear where that path led. Instead, Charlie deployed the subtler weapons of insinuation and doubt. Poison dropped into willing ears. "Mighty fine biscuits this morning," he'd say loud enough for others to hear, his voice carrying implications that turned innocent words ugly. "Woman sure knows how to keep the boss satisfied with her cooking skills." Or funny how Jake started defending her so fierce right after she moved into that lean-to shelter. Wonder what changed his mind so sudden-like. Bill Taggart proved a willing ally. His resentment over firewood splitting finally finding proper outlet through cruelty dressed as concern. Always wondered why Morrison pays her near twice what most cooks earn. Makes perfect sense now, don't it? Jake felt the crew's loyalty fracturing like green wood in a hard freeze. Men he'd worked alongside for months now watched him with calculating eyes, measuring his defense of Mercy against their own prejudices and finding the balance wanting. But the real test came when old Murphy collapsed during afternoon timber cutting. The 60-year-old sawyer simply folded at the knees like a marionette with cut strings, dropping his end of the crosscut saw and falling face first into the carpet of pine needles. Sweat poured from his gray face despite the cool mountain air, his breathing coming in short. Painful gasps that spoke of something seriously wrong with the machinery inside his chest. "Heart trouble," Tommy Sullivan whispered, kneeling beside the fallen man with the wide-eyed fear of youth confronting mortality. "My granddad went the same way back in Ohio." Jake sent Pete racing down the mountain for the doctor in Cedar Falls, a 2-hour ride each direction if the horse held up and the rocky trail didn't claim them both, which left them watching Murphy struggle for each breath while evening shadows crept across the timber cutting like spilled ink. "Ain't nothing we can do but wait and pray," Bill Taggart pronounced with the grim authority of someone who'd seen death before and learned not to fight battles that couldn't be won. "Doc gets here, or he don't. Old man makes it through, or he don't." But Mercy appeared at Jake's elbow with her arms full of supplies, moving with the same quiet efficiency she brought to kitchen work but now directed toward keeping a man's heart beating instead of filling his stomach. "Help me get him back to the cook fire," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd faced medical emergencies before. "I need hot water and steady light to work proper." "Ma'am, I don't rightly think—" "My grandmother nursed miners through everything from cave-ins to claim disputes gone bad. Heart trouble ain't nothing new if you know what signs to watch for." She knelt beside Murphy, her hands gentle, as she checked his pulse against the beat of her pocket watch. "He's not dying today, if I can help it." They rigged a stretcher from pine poles and rope, taking turns carrying Murphy back to the central fire where Mercy had already set water to boiling. She worked with methodical precision, but now her attention focused on keeping an old man's damaged heart beating instead of preparing the evening meal. Willow bark tea to thin his blood and ease the strain. Cool cloths for his burning forehead. Her voice soft and steady as she talked him through each labored breath like a mother coaching a frightened child. "Easy now, Mr. Murphy. Breathe with me slow and steady. In through the nose, out through the mouth. That's exactly right." Jake found himself holding Murphy's legs steady while Mercy worked, watching her hands move with absolute confidence despite the gravity of what they faced. Whatever doubts plagued her in other areas of camp life, here she moved with the sureness of someone who'd walked this ground before. "Where'd you learn doctoring like this?" Jake asked quietly, pitching his voice low so Murphy wouldn't hear. "Grandmother taught me to read bodies like recipes. Symptoms tell you what's wrong inside. Same as burnt edges tell you the fire's running too hot." She felt Murphy's pulse again, counting beats against her watch with professional concentration. His heart's working too hard against itself. Need to calm it down before the muscle gives out completely. Around them, the crew gathered in a loose circle, drawn by the drama of life and death being played out by firelight. Charlie Walsh watched with the calculating attention of a man who saw opportunity even in crisis, measuring how this emergency might be twisted to serve his own purposes. "Mighty convenient she knows so much about tending sick men up close and personal," he murmured to Bill Taggart, his voice pitched just loud enough to be overheard. "Makes a fellow wonder what kind of experience she's had caring for folks in need." The ugly implication hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Jake felt his muscles coiling for another confrontation, but Mercy's voice cut through the tension before violence could spark. "Mr. Walsh, I'll need you to ride down and meet the doctor partway up the trail. Tell him we got a man with heart trouble and what medicines I've already given him." "I ain't taking orders from no Charlie." Jake's voice carried the flat authority of someone whose patience had worn thin as mountain air. "Do exactly what she says. Now." Charlie's face darkened like a thundercloud building over the peaks, but he stalked toward the horses without further argument, muttering words that probably wouldn't bear repeating in polite company. Through the long evening hours, Mercy fought for Murphy's life with the same stubborn determination she brought to every challenge that crossed her path. When his breathing grew shallow as creek water, she made him sip hot broth. When fever spiked like a summer wildfire, she bathed his face with cool water drawn fresh from the spring. When his heart raced like a spooked Mustang, she talked him through breathing exercises that gradually slowed the frantic rhythm to something approaching normal. Jake watched her work and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of who she really was beneath the assumptions he'd carried. This wasn't just competent nursing, this was someone who'd faced death before and refused to surrender ground without fighting for every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of life that could be preserved through skill and determination. "Your grandmother taught you all this?" he asked during a quiet moment when Murphy's breathing had steadied. "Some of it. Rest I learned when Papa took sick with the lung fever." Her hands never stilled as she spoke, adjusting Murphy's position to ease his breathing while monitoring his pulse. "Took him 3 months to die, and I fought for every single day. Gave me plenty of time to learn what helped and what didn't make any difference at all." Sounds like hard schooling. Hardest kind there is, but useful knowledge. She managed a tired smile that held more warmth than he'd seen from her in days. "Man lives or dies based on what you do in moments like this. No room for squeamishness or second-guessing yourself." Dr. Hendricks arrived near midnight, a thin man with steady hands and the weary competence of someone who'd spent 40 years patching up mountain folk who lived hard and died harder. He examined Murphy with professional thoroughness, then turned to Mercy with something approaching genuine respect in his tired eyes. Good work keeping him stable when most folks would have panicked and made things worse. You kept him breathing when his heart wanted to quit. He repacked his medical bag with efficient movements born of long practice. He'll need careful watching for the next few days, but the worst has passed. As the doctor prepared for his return journey to town, Jake caught the subtle exchange between him and Mercy, technical questions about dosages and symptoms that revealed knowledge deeper than folk remedies learned from grandmothers. "You've had proper medical training," Jake observed once they were alone beside Murphy's sleeping form. "Some. Before Papa got sick. I worked as assistant to Dr. Patterson down in Cedar Falls. Learned to read symptoms and compound medicines under proper supervision." She adjusted Murphy's blanket with the same gentle care she brought to everything. "Lost that position when Mrs. Patterson decided my presence made her husband uncomfortable during his professional duties." The familiar pattern of rejection based on appearance rather than capability, but this time with implications that made Jake's stomach clench like a fist. How many times had she faced such situations? How many positions lost to other people's assumptions about what a large woman might be willing to accept in exchange for honest work? From across the dying fire, Bill Taggart's voice carried clearly in the night air, pitched for anyone still awake to hear. Convenient she knows so much about tending men in their weakest moments. Makes you wonder what other kinds of services she provided in her various positions around town. Several crew members chuckled at the crude implication, the sound carrying across camp like the call of scavenging coyotes. Jake felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler, but Mercy's hand on his arm stopped him from rising to confront the ugliness. "Let it go," she whispered, her voice carrying a defeated acceptance that cut deeper than any anger could have. "Some battles ain't worth fighting because you can't win them, no matter how hard you try." But Jake saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a beaten-down acceptance that spoke of someone who'd finally heard the whispers one time too many and begun believing the poison they contained. As if the weight of constant speculation had finally cracked something essential inside her that had kept her strong through every other hardship. Murphy stirred restlessly in his blanket, muttering words that might have been names or prayers. Mercy leaned forward to check his pulse with practiced efficiency, and in the firelight Jake caught sight of tears she'd been too proud to shed where others might see them fall. She was breaking apart slowly, quietly, but breaking nonetheless under the relentless pressure of accusation she couldn't answer without giving them more weight than they deserved. The same steady strength that had saved Murphy's life was being worn away by cruelty disguised as concern. And Charlie Walsh, watching from his bedroll with satisfaction gleaming in his eyes like reflected firelight, had finally found the lever that might pry her loose from her position in camp. All he had to do was keep applying steady pressure until something inside her snapped completely. The moment of truth. The dead pine had been hanging over the trail for weeks, its massive trunk caught in the fork of a living tree, 30 feet above the path that led down to the spring. Jake had marked it for cutting when time allowed, but other work always took priority. Dead trees fell when they fell, usually during storms, usually at night, usually where they could do no harm to man or beast. This one chose its moment with the precision of divine judgment. Tommy Sullivan was gathering kindling for the evening fire, working his way down the familiar trail with the casual confidence of youth that hadn't yet learned to fear what lurked in mountain shadows. Mercy had sent him for specific pieces, pine knots that would burn hot and steady through the night, the kind that required searching among the deadfall for exactly the right specimens. The crack started small, like the sound of a man stepping on a dry branch. Then it grew into something larger, splitting the mountain quiet with the groaning protest of wood under impossible strain and gravity's relentless pull. Tommy looked up just as 3 tons of dead pine broke free from its precarious perch and plummeted toward the trail, like the very hammer of God coming down to earth. He tried to run. His young legs almost carried him clear. The trunk caught him across both legs, driving him face first into the rocky path with a sound that carried all the way back to camp like the crack of a rifle shot. Pine needles and broken branches showered down around the massive log that now lay across the trail like a fallen bridge spanning nothing but Tommy's crushed hopes. Tommy's scream cut through the mountain air high, desperate, the sound of a 19-year-old boy who understood with crystal clarity that he might die on this trail far from home and family. Jake reached the scene first, driven by instinct and the crew boss responsibility that had kept him alive through 10 years of dangerous work in unforgiving country. The sight that met him turned his blood to ice water flowing through his veins. Tommy lay pinned beneath the log's crushing weight, his legs trapped from mid-thigh, down in a prison of dead wood and stone. Blood seeped from where rough bark had scraped his face raw against the rocky trail. But he was conscious, aware, looking up at Jake with eyes that held too much understanding of what this meant. "Boss," Tommy whispered, his voice tight with controlled panic that threatened to break loose at any moment. "I can't feel my legs at all." The log measured 18 inches through at the thickest point green pine that would weigh twice what any single man could lift, even on his best day. Jake dropped to his knees beside Tommy's head, his mind racing through options that all ended in the same place: failure. "Easy, boy. Well, we'll get you out of this mess." But how? The nearest town lay hours away down treacherous mountain roads. The crew had no equipment designed for moving such crushing weight. And Tommy's breathing was already growing shallow, his face pale with shock and blood loss that spoke of internal damage beyond what eyes could see. Footsteps crashed through the timber behind Jake like a cavalry charge. Mercy appeared at a dead run, her blue dress catching on branches as she forced her way through the undergrowth with desperate efficiency. She took one look at the situation and began moving with the same methodical calm she brought to medical emergencies. "How long has he been pinned like this?" "Just happened. Maybe 2 minutes at most." She knelt beside the massive trunk, running her hands along its length with the professional assessment of someone evaluating a problem that had to be solved quickly, or not at all. "Tommy, can you wiggle your toes for me?" Tommy's face contorted with effort that showed in every line of his young features. "No, ma'am. Nothing below the knees responds at all. Circulation's cut off clean. We got maybe 20 minutes before the damage becomes permanent." She stood, scanning the surrounding trees with calculating eyes that measured angles and leverage points. "Jake, I need that iron pry bar from camp. And every piece of rope we got, all of it." "Mercy, even with proper leverage. Just get it? Now!" Her voice carried absolute authority, the same tone she'd used directing Murphy's treatment when death hung in the balance. Jake found himself running toward camp without further argument, driven by something in her manner that brooked no discussion. The crew had gathered by the time he returned, drawn by Tommy's intermittent cries for help that echoed through the timber like the calls of a wounded animal. Pete Kowalski carried one end of the iron pry bar, while Bill Taggart lugged coiled rope over his shoulder with grim efficiency. "What's the plan here?" Bill demanded, his weathered face set in lines that spoke of knowledge about what they truly faced. Take 4 men to budge something that size, and that's on level ground. But Mercy was already working with the focused intensity of someone who'd calculated the odds and decided to fight them anyway. She'd positioned herself at the log's thick end, where leverage would be strongest and most effective. The iron bar went under the trunk at a carefully chosen angle that would lift rather than simply roll the crushing weight. "I'll work the pry bar. Rest of you get rope around the log's middle section. When I lift, you pull sideways, roll it off the trail, and away from Tommy. Charlie Walsh shouldered forward with the swagger of a man who'd found opportunity in crisis. Woman, you can't lift that much weight by yourself. Take 4 strong men to budge something that size. And that's the honest truth. Mercy's hands found their grip on the pry bar's handle, her feet set wide for maximum stability. Maybe so. Maybe not. Tommy dies for certain if we don't try everything we got. She set her stance, bent her knees for proper leverage, and threw her full weight against the iron lever with the desperate strength of someone fighting for another person's life. The pry bar groaned under impossible stress. The massive log shifted barely perceptible, but genuine movement nonetheless. Now! She grated through clenched teeth, every muscle in her body straining against physics and gravity. The crew hauled on their ropes with desperate coordination. 6 men fighting to roll 3 tons of dead pine, while Mercy held it suspended by pure force of will. The massive trunk rolled perhaps 6 inches before her strength gave out, and it settled back into place with crushing finality. Tommy screamed as the weight redistributed across his already damaged legs, the sound carrying across the mountains like a prayer for deliverance that might not come. Again, Mercy commanded, repositioning the bar for better leverage despite the tremor in her hands. Ready when you are. This time Jake added his strength to hers, both of them straining against the iron bar while 6 men fought to roll death itself away from a boy who'd done nothing worse than gather kindling. The log moved another few inches, then another. But it wasn't enough. Tommy's legs remained trapped, and exhaustion was taking its toll on everyone involved in the desperate struggle. Can't hold it. Pete gasped, his face red with exertion that bordered on collapse. Charlie Walsh threw down his rope in disgust, sweat pouring from his face despite the cool mountain air. This ain't working worth a damn. Need real equipment, not some fool woman's idea of how leverage works. Then what's your brilliant suggestion? Mercy snapped, perspiration streaming down her face despite the afternoon chill. Charlie's mouth worked silently like a fish pulled from water, because there was no other suggestion to be made. No miraculous solution waiting in the wings. Just the growing certainty that Tommy Sullivan was going to die on this trail while they watched helplessly. Wait just a minute. Bill Taggart's gravelly voice cut through their despair like an axe through dead wood. The old miner was studying the fallen tree with different eyes, not as an obstacle to remove, but as an engineering problem to be solved through mountain wisdom. We've been going about this all wrong from the start. He walked to where the log's shattered end lay among scattered bark and broken branches, debris from the tree's violent fall. Don't need to lift the whole dad-blasted weight, just need to shift it sideways enough to free his legs. Bill positioned himself at the log's narrow end, wrapped his arms around the trunk like he was embracing an old friend, and simply began pushing. Not pushing laterally, using his full body weight against the wood in a direction that worked with physics instead of fighting it. This end weighs maybe 300 pounds instead of 3,000. He grunted as the log began moving sideways across the trail. Rest of you work the middle section. Roll it toward me while I push from here. Understanding dawned like sunrise breaking over mountain peaks. They didn't need to defeat the log's crushing weight, just redirect it. Push from one end while pulling from the other, using the trapped point as a fulcrum instead of fighting against it. The strategy worked with shocking suddenness that left them all staring. The massive trunk rolled sideways across the rocky trail, finally coming to rest against a standing pine 6 feet from where Tommy lay gasping with relief and pain in equal measure. The boy's legs were a mess scraped raw. Probably broken. Definitely swollen beyond recognition, but he was free. And when Mercy checked his pulse and pupil response, with professional efficiency. Her face showed the first genuine relief Jake had seen from her in days. Concussion, broken ribs, maybe a fractured thigh bone that'll need proper setting, but he'll live to see tomorrow. She began checking his legs with gentle thoroughness that spoke of real medical training. Feelings coming back to his toes already. No permanent damage if we get him down to the doctor before complications set in. They rigged a stretcher from pine poles and rope, taking turns carrying Tommy down the mountain trail toward Cedar Falls and proper medical care. But as they worked, Jake found himself watching Bill Taggart with new understanding that changed everything he thought he knew about the grizzled miner. The old man had solved their problem not through superior strength or special equipment, but through simple refusal to accept defeat when a good boy's life hung in the balance. The same stubborn persistence he brought to everything else, including his hostility toward Mercy that had poisoned camp life for weeks. "Good thinking back there, Bill," Jake said quietly as they prepared to move Tommy down the trail. Bill's weathered face darkened like a storm cloud gathering over distant peaks. "Don't make nothing special of it. Just didn't want to watch a decent boy die for no good reason when there was something that could be done." But Jake had seen something else in Bill's eyes during those desperate minutes when Tommy's life hung by a thread. Something that looked remarkably like genuine respect for the woman who'd been first to act. First to organize a rescue attempt, first to risk everything she had for Tommy's survival. The realization hit Jake with uncomfortable clarity. Bill Taggart's prejudice wasn't rooted in genuine hatred or malice. It was fear wearing the mask of anger. Fear of having his comfortable assumptions challenged. Fear of admitting he'd been wrong about someone he'd judged so harshly based on nothing more than appearance. And if Bill could be reached if the crew's most vocal opponent could be made to see past his own defensive reactions, then maybe others would follow his lead toward something approaching fairness. But as they carried Tommy toward town and proper medical care, Jake caught Charlie Walsh watching the proceedings with cold calculation, as if measuring how this dramatic rescue might be twisted to serve his own ugly purposes. The man wasn't finished with Mercy yet. If anything, her competence under extreme pressure had only made her a more dangerous threat to his vision of how the world should properly work. New foundations. Winter's first snow arrived 3 weeks after Tommy's rescue, dusting the mountain peaks with white that promised harder weather ahead. The boy had healed well under Dr. Hendricks's care. His legs bore scars but carried his weight without complaint, and his laugh had returned to brighten evening conversations around the central fire. But the real change lay deeper, in the way men spoke to each other and to Mercy when they thought nobody else was listening. Bill Taggart proved the most surprising transformation of all. The grizzled miner who'd spent weeks making cruel comments now sought Mercy's counsel on camp improvements, winter preparations, even personal matters that had nothing to do with cooking or kitchen work. "Been thinking about that root cellar we discussed," he said, settling beside her at the morning fire where bacon grease popped and hissed in the iron skillet. "Ground's going to freeze hard soon. Best start digging while we still can work the earth proper." Mercy looked up from the sourdough starter she was feeding with careful attention, surprise flickering across her features like candlelight on water. "You want to dig a root cellar? That's considerable work for something that only benefits the cooking side of things. Benefits all of us. Eating fresh vegetables through winter instead of nothing but tinned goods and dried beans." Bill's weathered hands gestured toward the meadow behind the cook shelter, where morning frost sparkled like scattered diamonds. "Figure we dig down 6 feet, line the walls with flat stones from the creek, build proper shelves for storing preserves and such." She nodded slowly, her mind already working through the practical details that would make the difference between success and wasted effort. Need good drainage so water don't pool and freeze, and ventilation to keep air fresh without letting cold penetrate too deep. Exactly what I was thinking myself. Jake paused in his morning equipment check, watching the easy collaboration between two people who'd been sworn enemies just weeks before. The sight stirred something warm in his chest, not just relief at the reduced tension, but genuine pleasure at seeing Mercy treated with the respect her competence had always deserved. Pete Kowalski emerged from his tent already dressed for the day's timber cutting, but instead of heading straight for the work site, he made a deliberate detour toward the cook fire where coffee steamed in the morning air. "Morning, Miss Mercy. That liniment you mixed up for my shoulder's working real fine. Joint don't ache near as much when the weather changes. Glad to hear it's helping. Keep using it twice daily, especially before you sleep. Mountain weather's hard on old injuries." "Yes, ma'am. I surely will. And I wanted to ask, my sister down in Cedar Falls is expecting her first child come spring. You know anything about helping with birthing babies?" Mercy's hands stilled in their work, the wooden spoon suspended over her sourdough like she was considering weighty matters. "Some knowledge. My grandmother delivered babies when the regular midwife wasn't available or couldn't reach folks in time. Taught me the basics before I left home for my own life. Would you consider going down to town when her time comes? I'd pay proper wages. Of course, just she's nervous about it being her first and all, and she don't know who to trust with something so important." Jake found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response. The request represented something larger than medical assistance. It was acceptance, recognition that her skills extended far beyond camp cooking into the essential work that bound communities together through life's most critical moments. "I'd be honored to help when the time comes," Mercy said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the sacred trust being offered. "Send word when she needs me, and I'll come down to assist however I can." Pete's face lit with genuine relief that transformed his weathered features. "Thank you kindly, ma'am. Means a powerful lot to know she'll have proper care from someone who knows what they're doing." As Pete headed toward the timber cutting with lighter steps, Jake moved closer to the fire. The morning routine had become his favorite part of each day, coffee shared in companionable silence. Watching Mercy's efficient preparations for meals that somehow made the mountain camp feel less like exile and more like a place where a man might actually want to stay. "You're getting famous around these parts," he observed, settling on the pine stump that had become his usual seat. "Word's spreading down the mountain about the woman who can cook, nurse, and engineer rescues all in the same week." A smile tugged at the corner of Mercy's mouth, the first genuine warmth he'd seen from her since the ugly business with his cousin. "Reputation's a dangerous thing to carry. People start expecting miracles when all you got is common sense and willingness to work. What you did for Tommy was close enough to miraculous for most folks' accounting. That was just using what my grandmother taught me about leverage and not giving up when things look hopeless." Mercy poured coffee into Jake's tin cup, the familiar ritual that had evolved between them carrying new weight now. She said mountain folk needed someone who could do whatever needed doing, not specialists who only knew one trade. Smart woman to understand that. She was indeed. Taught me that survival means adapting to whatever life throws at you, not waiting around for perfect circumstances to present themselves. Jake sipped his coffee, studying Mercy's profile in the early morning light that turned everything golden. Something had changed in her bearing over the past weeks, a gradual relaxation of the defensive tension she'd carried since her arrival, as if she'd finally begun to believe she might actually belong here among these rough men and dangerous work. "Been thinking about spring and what comes after," he said carefully. "Oh..." She didn't look up from her work, but he caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders that suggested the topic mattered more than she wanted to admit. "Contract with the timber company runs through next October. Crew that proves reliable gets renewal, usually with better terms and steadier work." Sounds like good business for everyone involved. Jake set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, choosing his words with the deliberate care of someone walking across thin ice. Would need a cook who's planning to stay long term, someone who understands mountain work and gets along proper with the crew. Now she did look at him, her dark eyes searching his face for meanings that went beyond practical discussions of employment and contracts. You offering me permanent position here? Offering you a place that could be home if that's what you want, long as you want it to be. The words hung between them like morning mist, carrying implications that went far beyond cooking arrangements and winter preparations. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for her response, knowing that everything he'd begun to hope for depended on what she said next. Mercy's hands resumed their work, but her voice, when she spoke, held new warmth that hadn't been there before. Might be I'd like that considerable. Been too long since I had a place that felt like it could truly be home. Relief flooded through Jake's chest like warm whiskey on a cold night. Good. That's real good to hear. They worked in comfortable silence after that, the morning routine taking on new significance now that it carried the promise of countless similar mornings to come. Jake found himself cataloging details, the way lamplight caught the concentration on Mercy's face, the efficient movements of her hands as she prepared for another day of feeding hungry men, the contentment that had replaced her earlier wariness. When old Murphy emerged from his tent, moving carefully but under his own power, Jake felt the circle of acceptance complete itself. The Sawyer who'd nearly died in Mercy's arms now treated her with the quiet reverence reserved for someone who'd literally saved his life. Morning, Miss Mercy. How's that heart medicine holding up? Should last another month or so. I'll brew fresh when we start running low. She handed him a cup of coffee mixed with the willow bark tea that kept his damaged heart beating steady as clockwork. How'd you sleep through the night? Like a baby in his mother's arms. That mattress Pete helped me build makes all the difference in the world. Jake smiled at the easy familiarity between them, the natural bond that had formed between healer and patient. Murphy's near-death experience had cracked something open in the entire crew, forced them to confront how quickly life could change, how valuable competent care could be when crisis struck without warning. Even Charlie Walsh had softened his hostility, though he still watched Mercy with calculating eyes that suggested his prejudice had been driven underground rather than truly eliminated. But Charlie was one man among 11 now united in recognition of Mercy's worth, and winter would test everyone's ability to work together for survival. Snow began falling more heavily as the day progressed, thick flakes that promised serious accumulation by evening. Jake watched Mercy move through her routines, checking food stores, organizing winter equipment, discussing with Bill the urgent need to complete their root cellar before ground freeze made digging impossible. She'd found her place, here through patient competence and quiet courage, proving herself worthy of respect through nothing more complicated than showing up, doing the work, and refusing to be driven away by other people's limitations. The transformation felt almost miraculous, from outcast to essential community member through simple persistence and skill. As evening approached and the crew gathered around the central fire for supper, Jake caught Mercy's eye across the flames and felt the future spreading before them like fresh snow, clean, unmarked, full of possibilities that two people working together might create from whatever materials the mountain provided. The taste of that first venison stew had opened his eyes to his own blindness, forced him to confront the poverty of his assumptions about worth and value. But this, watching her laugh at one of Pete's stories while snow fell softly around their sheltered camp, this tasted like the beginning of something worth building a life around. Winter was coming, hard and unforgiving as always. But for the first time in years, Jake found himself looking forward to the long months of isolation and dependence on each other for survival. he wouldn't be facing them alone. None of them would. As long as Mercy Hawthorne remained willing to call this rough place home, the mountains kept their own ledger of human worth, measured not in appearance or social standing, but in what people did when survival demanded their very best. On that accounting, Mercy's name was written in permanent ink, earned through competence, courage, and the quiet revolution of simply refusing to disappear when others found her presence inconvenient. The taste of acceptance, Jake discovered, was sweeter than any meal he'd ever eaten. The end. In the Colorado high country, where judgment came swift and second chances were rarer than gold nuggets, Mercy Hawthorne had carved out a place through nothing more complicated than showing up, doing honest work, and refusing to be driven away by other people's narrow vision. Some victories were won with violence and force. Others required only the patient courage to prove that worth had nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with what a person chose to do when the moment demanded their finest qualities. The mountains kept their own accounting, and on that eternal ledger, Mercy's value was recorded in permanent ink. Connecting communities. Sometimes the most powerful stories emerge from the simplest truths about human dignity and the courage to see past our first impressions. In crafting Mercy Hawthorne's journey from rejection to acceptance in that Colorado mountain camp, I found myself confronting my own assumptions about worth, appearance, and the quiet heroism required to judge people by their character rather than their circumstances. This tale grew from watching how real communities form not through grand proclamations, but through daily acts of competence, kindness, and stubborn persistence in the face of prejudice. Mercy's transformation from outcast to essential community member mirrors something I've witnessed in countless small towns and tight-knit groups: how bias crumbles when consistently confronted with evidence of genuine character. Jake Morrison's initial blindness wasn't born of malice, but of lazy thinking, the human tendency to categorize rather than truly see the person standing before us. His journey toward recognition required the humility to admit error and the wisdom to value substance over surface judgments. The mountain setting provided more than mere backdrop. It created conditions where survival depended on recognizing genuine capability regardless of its packaging. In harsh environments, competence matters more than conformity to social expectations. Perhaps that's why this story feels relevant beyond its 1880s frontier setting, in our own era of quick judgments and surface assessments. Mercy's quiet dignity offers a different model, one where worth is proven through patient action and the revolutionary act of simply refusing to disappear when others prefer not to acknowledge your presence. Disclaimer: this work is inspired by classic Western frontier narratives and created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.